The summer heat in Washington, D.C. pressed down like a furnace, but the soldier in the black uniform didn't move. Sweat trickled beneath his collar, slid down his spine, but his stance was perfect, motionless, unbreakable. His rifle rested against his shoulder, gleaming under the sunlight. Then it happened. A voice sharp and mocking cut through the plaza. "Salute me, soldier, or you will regret it." The words came from Colonel Dmitry Orlov of the Russian army, his chest heavy with medals, his jaw set like iron. The crowd froze. Delegates from Japan, Germany, China, and half a dozen other countries turned their heads. Cameras went up. Phones started recording. Even a group of American schoolchildren fell silent, sensing the drama unfolding in front of them. A confrontation was about to explode in the heart of America's capital. This is the story of a tomb guard, a man sworn to silence and duty facing the arrogance of a foreign officer under the burning sun. What happened next shook the entire plaza, stunned the international forum, and carried echoes of a forgotten war. Follow my story to the end and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, so I know how far this story has traveled. Ethan Ward's jaw was locked, his eyes fixed beyond the crowd. At 6'2", built like a marble pillar, he was the embodiment of discipline. His uniform bore no wrinkles, his medals lined with precision, his gloves, a pristine white against the black of his rifle sling. He was 30 years old, but the posture he carried was timeless. Ethan wasn't on his usual ground today. He belonged to Arlington National Cemetery, guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier, where silence carried the weight of eternity. There, his world was 30 steps of sacred ritual performed through rain, snow, or blazing heat. Today was different. He had been ordered to stand at the International Security Forum, a plaza of marble and glass swarmed by foreign delegations flashing cameras and chatter in a dozen tongues. It was noisy, alive, unpredictable. But Ethan's training didn't falter. He had been taught to remain still, to embody honor itself, no matter the distraction. A line of black SUVs pulled up, engines, low wheels crunching on the stone. Out stepped the Russian delegation. The air seemed to grow heavier. At the front was Colonel Orlov, 48 years old, thin but wiry, his eyes gray like cold steel. He'd fought in Chechnya and Syria. His uniform announced it with rows of ribbons. To him, the American ceremony looked like theater, a play for tourists. He stopped dead in his tracks when he spotted Ethan. The interesting Orlov muttered his English thick with accent. "They dress their soldiers like museum statues." The words carried across the plaza. Delegates nearby shifted, uncomfortable. A few laughed politely, unsure whether to react. But Orlov didn't stop. He marched forward straight toward Ethan, the heels of his boots striking marble like hammer blows. "Soldier," he barked. "In Russia we salute those who have earned it. Show me your respect. Give me a salute." The colonel raised his hand in demonstration, a crisp motion, fingers rigid, palm out. He held the pose, waiting. The plaza hushed. A German officer paused, his eyes narrowing. A Japanese general arched an eyebrow. Schoolchildren clutched their backpacks, staring wide-eyed at the black uniformed guard who stood frozen. But Ethan did not move. His pulse quickened, yes, but not a flicker showed in his stance. He had been heckled before. Tourists at Arlington had tried to make him laugh, to force him to speak. He had endured storms of distraction, insults thrown in jest. But this was different. This was not a tourist. This was a career officer, a man used to obedience. Orlov's smirk faded. He stepped closer, his breath hot with disdain. "Do you hear me, soldier? I am Colonel Dmitry Orlov, Russian Armed Forces. I fought in wars you cannot imagine. Show respect." Ethan's rifle remained still angled against his shoulder. His eyes looked past Orlov as if the colonel were nothing but a shadow. "Or are you afraid to move, boy?" The word boy struck like a knife. In his mind, Ethan saw his friend's face, Staff Sergeant Michael Reyes, laughing inside a Humvee in Iraq, only to vanish a heartbeat later when the roadside blast tore through metal and flame. Ethan had carried Reyes' memory to Arlington step by step, vow by vow. His oath was not to petty insults or foreign egos. His oath was to the fallen. The crowd murmured. A teacher pulled her students back, worry written across her face. Delegates whispered. Cameras zoomed closer. Orlov was now inches away from Ethan's chest, and Ethan still did not move. From the far side of the plaza, Major Sarah Collins caught the exchange. 34 crisp uniform hair tied back in a strict bun, She was fluent in 3 languages and trained to prevent sparks from turning into flames. She quickened her steps, her heels sharp against the marble. Beside her, an older man noticed too Colonel James Whitaker, silver-haired, once commander of the Old Guard itself. His eyes seasoned with decades of ceremony and conflict fixed on the Russian. Still, neither intervened yet. To step in too soon risked making it worse. Meanwhile, Orlov squared his shoulders and let his voice rise, echoing across the marble plaza. This is America's discipline, a statue with no soul. In Russia, soldiers burn with fire. They act. He leaned in, face inches from Ethan's, and repeated, "Salute me!" But Ethan remained unmoved, a sentinel carved from stone. The schoolboy who had been whispering earlier tugged at his teacher's sleeve, his eyes wide. "Why doesn't he just do it?" The teacher shook her head slowly, whispering, "Because he can't. He won't." The crowd held its breath. Cameras caught every angle. The Russian colonel's jaw tightened. He was used to breaking men with his presence. But the man before him was no ordinary soldier. And as the sun blazed on Washington, D.C., the first sparks of an international fire crackled on the marble floor. The plaza still vibrated with tension long after Colonel Orlov's demand rang out. Phones hovered, recording every second, a digital jury of millions waiting to judge the outcome. Ethan Ward stood unmoved, a figure of silence and steel, his rifle gleaming in the sun. The colonel's gray eyes bored into him, searching for weakness, but none came. The soldier's 1,000-yard stare remained fixed on a point beyond the world in front of him. Beneath the flawless surface, Ethan's heart pumped steady, controlled. He had learned to master it, learned the hard way. 5 years earlier, under a different sun, a different sky, Ethan had fought in Iraq. He remembered the dry heat baking the desert road, the metallic taste of dust in his mouth, the smell of burnt rubber after a roadside blast. He remembered Sergeant Michael Reyes' laughter, a sound full of life, one moment gone in the scream of fire the next. Reyes had been his brother-in-arms, the one who'd watched Ethan's back when their patrols stretched into endless nights. And then, in an instant, he was gone. The blast had ripped the Humvee apart, flames consuming what seconds earlier had been camaraderie. Ethan had survived, but survival felt like betrayal. When he returned to American soil, he carried a burden heavier than any packed the need to honor those who never made it home. That's why he had volunteered for the Old Guard, to stand watch where words failed to guard the tomb of the unknown soldier, where silence was a vow. At Arlington, he walked the sacred 21 steps, turned with precision, repeated it through rain, snow, sweltering heat. No words, no distractions, only devotion. Today was different. He wasn't at Arlington where the air itself demanded reverence. He was here at the International Security Forum, a plaza buzzing with diplomats, journalists, and curious tourists. Here, everything was noise, the chatter of interpreters, the clicking of polished shoes, the hum of engines from black SUVs lined along the curb. It was no sacred ground. It was unpredictable, chaotic, a place where respect wasn't given freely. Yet Ethan's duty was the same. His oath hadn't changed. Colonel Orlov tilted his head, lips curling again into that faint, disdainful smirk. He circled slowly like a predator, testing the defenses of prey. His aides followed 2 steps behind their uniforms, pressed their eyes darting between the colonel and the silent American. "They call this discipline," Orlov said, his voice pitched just loud enough for others to hear. A man frozen like a mannequin. In Russia, soldiers bleed, they sweat, they roar. Here, they pose. The words carried bouncing against marble, stirring unease in the crowd. A Japanese general glanced at his aide, murmuring something under his breath. A German officer checked her watch but stayed close, sensing the exchange meant more than a petty insult. Still, Ethan did not move. Inside his mind, he built a wall brick by brick, sealing himself behind training. His body screamed under the heat. Sweat tickled down his back, yet he made no attempt to wipe it. His eyes remained locked, unfocused, as though he were staring at eternity itself. He thought of Reyes, of the tomb of the words engraved in stone. Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God. Those words were his compass. Orlov's smirk faltered again. His voice sharpened like a knife. "Do you hear me, boy? I am Colonel Dmitry Orlov, veteran of wars you cannot dream of. Men like me built empires. Men like you stand in silence like toys. You will salute me. A flicker crossed Ethan's mind, an echo of another day at Arlington when a tourist had stepped too close to the barrier. Ethan's voice, trained to thunder when boundaries were crossed, had echoed, "Stay behind the chain." The crowd had jolted, reminded that silence did not mean weakness. Today, though, the rules were different. Here he was to remain silent, unshaken, no matter the provocation. The colonel leaned closer, close enough that Ethan could feel his breath. "Or are you too afraid?" From the corner of the plaza, Major Sarah Collins tightened her jaw. She could see it unraveling second by second. Orlov wasn't simply provoking, he was testing, searching for a crack he could exploit in front of the world. Her eyes darted toward Colonel James Whitaker, who stood with hands folded, his face unreadable. Whitaker had seen such standoffs before. His subtle nod told her what she already knew. Wait, watch, let the tomb guard prove why silence itself could cut sharper than words. The school children clutched their phones, whispering nervously. One boy muttered, "Why doesn't he just do it?" His teacher hushed him, pulling him back. Her own eyes fixed on the Russian colonel, and all the while Ethan's mind carried him away. Not away from duty, but deeper into it. He pictured the tomb marble glowing white under moonlight, the measured rhythm of boots against stone, the sacred quiet that no insult could tarnish. He remembered kneeling at Rhea's grave, whispering promises that his memory would never be forgotten. Every ounce of provocation from Orlov weighed against that vow and lost. So he stood unblinking, his silence screaming louder than Orlov's commands. The colonel's lips tightened. His pride was not used to such defiance, least of all in public, least of all on American soil. His voice rose again, a bark that cracked across the plaza. "Salute me, soldier." But Ethan Ward did not move. And for the first time in years, Dmitry Orlov felt something he had nearly forgotten: uncertainty. Colonel Dmitry Orlov did not retreat from uncertainty. He strangled it. The flicker that had crossed his face, gone in a blink, turned into something harsher, a stubborn set of the jaw that said he would reclaim the moment by force of will. He rolled his shoulders back, the sun flashing off the tin-bright edges of his metals, and stepped closer until the tips of his polished boots hovered near the invisible line between the plaza and the guard's post. Once again he set his voice smooth as a blade dragged over glass. He raised his right-hand elbow, tight palm outward. Fingers straight, a crisp Russian salute executed with theater-perfect precision. It cut the air like a command. "You will return respect with respect." Ethan Ward's eyes didn't waver. From a distance, a camera servo whirred as a network crew swung a long lens toward them. The collective breath of the plaza seemed to draw inward a space of silence swollen with 1,000 thoughts. Orlov held the salute, letting the seconds stretch out until they became something heavier, a weight he was certain would crush any young soldier's composure. It had worked before junior officers, border guards, checkpoint conscripts. A long silence could be made to feel like a crime. But Ethan's crimes, to the extent the world might imagine them, were carved inside time he would never get back. Iraq had taken that from him hours when a convoy never showed minutes stretched across a crater, a single second when laughter turned to light and heat. No one in this plaza could punish him with a longer silence than the one seated in his chest. He let Orlov's salute hang in the air like a storm that refused to break. Orlov's lips twitched. He lowered his hand with a little snap, the sound sharp enough to make a nearby schoolboy flinch. In Russia, he announced, pivoting to the semicircle of onlookers, as if stepping onto a stage. "We respect those who earn it. We salute men who fight, not men who pose." He sliced a glance back at Ethan. "Statues are for museums, not uniforms." A German officer shifted her weight, jaw tightening. A Japanese general folded his arms, gaze narrowing behind rimless glasses. Somewhere in the crowd, a man in a navy suit murmured the word provocation, and the word seemed to thread across the marble like a thin wire, catching shoes, catching whispers, catching nerves. Ethan didn't speak. He couldn't not unless bounds were crossed in a way his orders allowed him to correct. At the tomb, he had a voice when safety or sanctity demanded it. Here at the Forum, he had been given a different kind of order: represent the old guard by embodying its discipline. Silence, stillness, and an unwavering line. He felt the old rhythm of Arlington beating in his mind, 21 steps, pause, turn. Duty is motion, measured by reverence. Duty is the refusal to answer every noise with noise. Out of the corner of his eye, without moving his head, Ethan registered vectors, the angle of a boom mic rising the cluster of interns with lanyards edging closer, the polished confidence of a woman in a tailored army uniform cutting through the crowd. Major Sarah Collins. He had seen her name on the morning briefing liaison to the forum. She was moving fast, but not rushed her stride, calibrated her eyes, already appraising distances and consequences. 30 yards back, Colonel James Whitaker stood like a piece of living granite, his arms loose, his gaze level. Ethan had served under men who'd tried to emulate that kind of stillness. Whitaker didn't emulate. He simply was. Orlov rolled his neck, that faint clatter of ribboned metal answering, and came in again. "You will salute," he said, lowering his voice so only the closest layer of bodies could hear, which of course meant everyone leaned in. "You will acknowledge experience greater than yours." He tapped a finger against a medal set low on his row, the gesture blithe and chilling. "Chechnya. Syria. I have seen men stand stiff for cameras and crumble when bullets spoke." A tiny tick in Ethan's peripheral vision, the schoolboy from before the one with a constellation of freckles had slipped closer behind his teacher's arm. The kid's phone was out the case, an American flag faded with fingerprints. His mouth hung open, a human question mark. Ethan had seen that face before in airport terminals when the guard's black uniform pulled attention like gravity in D.C. sidewalks where tourists drifted into hush without knowing why. A child's eyes recognized sacredness before adults could rationalize it away. That instinct tugged at the boy now. Ethan's breath moved in a measured arc inhale, hold exhale, counted by habit. He thought of a moonlit shift at Arlington when a summer thunderstorm had rolled in from the river and the guard had walked the 21 steps with rain bullets hammering his shoulders. There had been no audience then, just the night and a promise that did not ask to be witnessed. It steadied him now, a quiet hand on his spine. Orlov could not stomach quiet. He pivoted sideways and demonstrated the salute again, a fraction sharper, a fraction more aggressive, like a fencer trying to land a touch. "It is simple," he said. "You lift your hand, you show respect, or you make insult to my country." No muscle moved in Ethan's jaw. The plaza magnified everything, the drip of water somewhere inside a planner, the hiss of hydraulics as a diplomatic SUV settled on its shocks, the whisper of a reporter rehearsing a stand-up under her breath. And then another sound, a single click, as Claire Donovan, a young D.C. reporter with a ponytail and a practiced eye, thumbed her phone into record. She angled to catch both faces and frame the Russians' carved arrogance and the Americans' inhuman calm. She knew the shape of a viral story, and it was drawing itself in light and heat before her. Major Collins arrived at the perimeter of the cluster and stopped. The tactical calculus had shifted. She could watch for 10 more seconds. 15. But Orlov was pacing closer to the line with each pass. She lifted a hand slightly, signaling a uniformed event security officer to hold at her flank. Her other hand found the crease of her pocket where a laminated card with forum protocols pressed cool against her knuckles. It was not lost on her that protocol was both shield and spark in moments like this. "Is he allowed to do that?" The schoolboy whispered the words, floating up toward whoever would catch them. His teacher swallowed, soft-voiced but sure. "He's not allowed to move." "That's different." She glanced down, then back up, as if choosing which truth to let the boy carry into his own years. "He's allowed to be brave." Orlov planted his feet again and leaned forward so close that Ethan could count the stitching in the Russian's collar. Afraid, Orlov said softly, almost tenderly, and for a heartbeat the insult felt like a prayer twisted wrong. "You are afraid to move." Ethan felt the word pass through him like wind through a gate. Afraid. He had been afraid in a street in Fallujah, where every shadow had teeth on a day when the sky turned to powdered fire. Afraid had come and gone so many times that it had lost the power to embarrass him. The trick had never been to be fearless. The trick was to be faithful. He could be afraid. He could still be faithful. He didn't blink. Orlov's patience slid into irritation. Irritation hardened into decision. He straightened, glanced over his shoulder, and then addressed the spectators with a half-smile that wanted applause. "Symbols," he said, nodding at Ethan's uniform, "are for children. Soldiers act." He lifted his hand one more time in the Russian salute. When the void of answer yawned between them again, the colonel dropped his arm and made a small, contemptuous grunt, half scoff, half dare. Major Collins took a breath now, she thought, and shifted her weight forward. But a motion from Whitaker held her back the barest tilt of chin. "Wait." The old commander's eyes didn't leave Orlov. He wasn't enjoying the spectacle. He was reading it, watching for the pivot point all veterans knew lay hidden in every confrontation, the inch where gesture becomes contact. Claire Donovan whispered into her phone mic. "Russian colonel demands salute from U.S. tomb guard 10 minutes into a diplomatic powder keg," and then she caught herself, cut the narration, and let the camera do the telling. The story didn't need her voice laid over it. This would be one of those clips that traveled on its own legs, page to page, country to country. Ethan's glove creaked faintly where leather met rifle sling. He felt heat crowding his collar, the prickling itch where sweat gathered and could not be wiped. He imagined the tomb again, not as escape, but as alignment. Marble. Moonlight. Words cut into stone that had outlived 100 arguments like this. Known, but to God. He stood to make those words true for as long as his body could, whether anyone watched or everyone did. The colonel made his move. He stepped inside the invisible boundary so near Ethan's chest that a breath might have brushed fabric, and lifted his hand without warning, 2 fingers extended as if to flick dust from a lapel. The crowd rippled forward involuntarily. Major Collins' heel scraped against marble as she started. Whitaker's pupils tightened, his head tilting the smallest degree. Orlov did not touch Ethan. Not yet. He hovered. Testing space, testing patience, testing how far an old soldier's ghost could walk into a younger soldier's orders. "I ask you for courtesy," he said, voice so controlled it shivered with self-restraint. "You give me..." Nothing. Nothing had a shape. Nothing could be the highest discipline in a world addicted to showing its teeth. Ethan gave him nothing. A gust carried the scent of hot stone and distant river water across the plaza. For a fragment of a second, the scene snapped into perfect stillness, a photograph the brain would file away even as the body lived on. Colonel Orlov blinked sweat from his eyelashes and let a soundless verdict pass across his face. If pride could not win, humiliation would. He lowered his hand and stepped half a pace back. His aides leaned in close to whisper, but he shook them off, eyes hardening with a new intent. The crowd felt the shift and murmured. Major Collins knew that look. So did Whitaker. Claire's camera caught the change in the lines around Orlov's mouth, the clenched geometry of a man deciding to cross a line so he could tell himself one had never existed. "Very well," Orlov said, voice carrying again. "If a toy cannot salute, perhaps it can be decorated." Ethan did not break posture, but he felt the warning bell ring in the back of his mind, the one born from 100 hours of instruction and 1,000 of ritual. There were lines drawn by ceremony, by respect, by safety. Some were painted, some were invisible, all were real. Orlov's hand slipped toward his breast pocket, where a small tarnished emblem waited, red star dulled by years and heat. He drew it out and weighed it in his palm, the sun catching an edge. The plaza leaned in every pair of lungs, forgetting its rhythm at once. Major Collins moved, Whitaker moved, Claire's camera tightened its frame. The schoolboy's mouth dropped open, and even his teacher forgot to pull him back. The colonel's eyes glittered with a peculiar triumph, the kind that mistakes audacity for courage. He took that last dangerous step. And the marble burning under summer remembered every footfall that had ever sounded like a threat. The emblem caught the sunlight as Colonel Orlov held it high enough for the cameras to catch the glint. Its red star, though worn from years of campaigns, carried the weight of pride and iron memory. His fingers closed around it with the reverence of a man convinced he was about to win something more valuable than an argument. Gasps rippled across the plaza. Delegates leaned forward, whispering in their own languages, trying to gauge whether this was bravado insult or madness. A Japanese general muttered something clipped while a German officer's eyes narrowed in alarm. Even the chatter of the school children evaporated, replaced by an instinctive hush. Something sacred was about to be tested. Since you refuse to salute, Orlov declared, his voice pitched to travel across the marble floor, then you will wear this, a real soldier's mark. The words were sharp, calculated, meant to humiliate not just Ethan Ward, but what he represented. He took the emblem between two fingers and with a soldier's certainty reached forward. His hand moved quickly, decisively pressing the metal pin against the pristine black of Ethan's uniform coat. The sound it made, a faint scrape against fabric, was loud enough to echo like thunder in Ethan's head. The violation was not physical pain, but spiritual. He had been trained for years that no hand, no object, no distraction ever crossed into the sacred integrity of the tomb guard uniform. It was not his, it belonged to the fallen, to history, to sacrifice. And now it had been trespassed. The crowd reacted instantly. A low chorus of shock, some gasps, a few shouts from the schoolchildren. Claire Donovan's camera phone shook for half a second before she locked it steady again, capturing every detail. The emblem glittered on Ethan's shoulder for a heartbeat, a foreign star on American soil. Then Ethan moved. It wasn't a flinch, not a retreat. It was precision, as sharp and clean as a blade drawn from its sheath. His gloved hand lifted in a perfect arc, pinched the emblem, and brushed it off with the same deliberate grace he would have used to remove a speck of dust from his rifle barrel. The pin hit the marble floor with a distinct metallic clink. That sound traveled through the silence like a gunshot. Orlov's head snapped back, eyes narrowing in fury. His chest rose, anger swelling like a tide. Before he could speak, Ethan's voice cut through the air, measured, calm, but loud enough for the microphones and the waiting cameras. "Sir," he said, the words clipped, even controlled. "Placing objects on a tomb guard is a violation of protocol. I request you maintain distance and respect my duty." For the first time all day, the tomb guard had broken his silence. The plaza froze. Delegates' faces shifted from curiosity to awe. The schoolboy's mouth hung open, his eyes wide. Even Claire, seasoned in the frenzy of politics and scandal, forgot for a moment that she was a journalist. She had just captured history. Orlov's face flushed crimson rage, overtaking his composure. His fists clenched at his sides, veins visible along his temples. "You dare," he growled, voice deep and raw, echoing through the plaza. "You touch my emblem, you insult my country." His voice climbed, booming with the fury of a man not used to being denied. "You will apologize, or Russia will walk out of this forum." Shouts erupted around them. Delegates exchanging sharp words. Security officers lifting radios to their lips, journalists calling out questions. The tension snapped like a cable pulled too tight. What had begun as a spectacle was seconds away from becoming a crisis. Major Sarah Collins moved in, then her heels striking marble like drum beats. She slid between Orlov and Ethan with flawless composure, her posture respectful but firm. "Colonel Orlov." She set her tone calm yet commanding. "I am Major Sarah Collins, liaison for the U.S. Army. May I assist you?" Orlov wheeled on her eyes, narrowing. "Assist," he spat. "Your soldier insults me. He refuses a simple gesture of respect. He refuses to acknowledge my rank. Explain this insult." Collins didn't flinch. "Colonel, the tomb guard follows strict protocol. Their duty is ceremonial, yes, but it is rooted in honoring our fallen. They do not respond to external commands regardless of who issues them." Ceremonial, Orlov barked, his voice rising again. "This is no parade ground, Major. This is a military forum. Soldiers act, statues stand." He jabbed a finger at Ethan, still frozen in his stance. "Tell him to act like a soldier." The crowd murmured louder. A Japanese general leaned toward his aide. A Polish officer whispered something sharp. Claire Donovan's phone captured every word, every expression. She knew she wasn't just reporting. This was the kind of footage that could ignite debate across continents. Colonel Collins said again, steady, her voice calm but edged with steel. "The tomb guard's silence is not disrespect. It is devotion." Orlov sneered, brushing her words aside. His pride burned too hot to accept calm explanations. He opened his mouth to retort, and then another voice cut through the storm. "Colonel Orlov." It was quiet yet commanding, the kind of voice that silences a room because it carries the gravity of memory. Colonel James Whitaker stepped forward, silver hair catching the sunlight, his uniform understated but heavy with the weight of years. His presence drew instant recognition from several American officers nearby. The man had commanded the Old Guard before he retired. His reputation carried far. Orlov turned sharply, bristling, but Whitaker's gaze held him in place. "I am Colonel James Whitaker," he said evenly, "retired commander of the Old Guard." His tone was polite, but his eyes, cold steel gray, offered no room for argument. "May I have a word?" The Russian colonel hesitated. For the first time since stepping out of his SUV, his bluster cracked. He gave a tight nod. "Very well," he said, voice dripping with disdain, but quieter now. Whitaker gestured toward the edge of the plaza where shade stretched beneath the awning. "Let's walk," he said, his voice firm but calm. The crowd parted, anticipation thick. Major Collins exhaled softly, relief tempered by unease. She wasn't sure what Whitaker was about to say, but she knew one thing: he wouldn't waste words. Ethan remained frozen in place, a sentinel carved from duty, his eyes forward. Yet he heard every syllable, every breath of the storm shifting around him. The emblem still lay on the marble, its red star glinting in the sun. The plaza seemed to breathe again as Colonel James Whitaker led Dmitry Orlov toward the shaded edge. Conversations rippled through the delegates, but no one dared step too close. The sound of cameras clicking and the hushed commentary of journalists filled the air, yet all eyes were still tethered to the black-uniformed tomb guard, who had not moved, not even after rejecting the Russian colonel's emblem. Ethan Ward remained upright, silent, unflinching, a sentinel. But silence in this case was not emptiness. It was a wall, a living boundary, that had just held against Orlov's full weight of arrogance, and it rattled the Russian officer. As the two colonels crossed into the shade, Major Sarah Collins followed several paces behind her presence, subtle but deliberate. If Whitaker was the scalpel, she would be the suture binding whatever wound might open from this encounter. Colonel Orlov Whitaker began, his voice measured but firm. "I understand your frustration." Orlov scoffed, folding his arms. His voice, though quieter now, still carried sharp edges. "Frustration, I demand respect, and your soldier spits on it." Whitaker's expression did not change. He was calm, but the weight behind his eyes was unmistakable. "No, Colonel. What you witnessed wasn't disrespect, it was devotion." Orlov's laugh was hollow, bitter. Devotion. To what? Standing still. To playing a statue while real soldiers fight and bleed. Whitaker let the words hang. Then, leaning slightly closer, he said, "To the fallen. To men who gave everything, including for people they did not know." The Russian stiffened. His jaw worked, but he said nothing. Whitaker pressed on his tone, neither accusatory nor indulgent, simply factual. "You think our tomb guards are for show, that their silence is weakness. I'll tell you a story. Afghanistan, 2009. A convoy ambushed. Do you remember it?" Orlov's eyes flickered. His lips parted. He hesitated long enough for the shade itself to feel heavier. "I remember," he admitted slowly, "a road outside Kunduz. We were pinned, burning vehicles. I nearly—" He cut himself off, then snapped. "What does that have to do with this?" Whitaker's gaze didn't waver. "Everything. Because one of my men was there, Sergeant Daniel Hayes, Old Guard before he deployed. He pulled you from that fire, took shrapnel across his chest to drag you out of a burning truck. He died 3 days later." The Russian's face drained of color. His breath caught sharp in his throat. The name Hayes was not one he had ever known. He had buried the memory of that nameless American who saved him, tucking it into some dark corner of his mind. And now here it returned in full force. Whitaker's voice softened, but the weight of it only grew. "Hayes is buried at Arlington. His name is remembered every time a tomb guard walks those 21 steps. And the man you just tried to humiliate, Ethan Ward, he is standing in Hayes' place honoring him. That's who you just tested." Silence fell heavy between them. Even Major Collins, who had trailed quietly, felt her throat tighten. She hadn't known this piece of history. The truth was like a stone dropped into still water, rippling across everything. Orlov's arms fell to his sides. His gaze dropped toward the marble floor where the tarnished emblem lay abandoned in the sun. He swallowed hard, but his voice, when it finally came, was rough, uneven. I didn't know his name. I only knew he was American. Whitaker nodded, once slow, deliberate. Now you do. His name was Hayes, and Ethan Ward's duty is not to salute you or me or anyone standing here. His duty is to Hayes and to every man and woman who never made it home. The Russian's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked back across the plaza where Ethan still stood motionless under the relentless sun. The school children, their faces full of awe, stared at him as if he were a monument come alive. Cameras still pointed his way, the crowd holding their breath. Major Collins broke the silence gently. Colonel Orlov, she said, perhaps after the forum you might visit Arlington. See the tomb. Pay your respects. It would mean something. For a long moment, Orlov didn't answer. His face was unreadable, locked between pride and something deeper. At last his shoulders straightened, not with arrogance, but with gravity. He shook his head slowly. Not today, he muttered, but soon. Whitaker studied him, then offered a small nod of respect. You'll be welcome when you do. From the center of the plaza, the cameras still rolled. The world still watched, but something had shifted. Orlov turned back toward the sunlight, his expression taut but changed. His boots struck marble with a different rhythm, now no longer sharp with disdain, but heavy with thought. As they emerged from the shade, the Russian delegation scrambled to follow, uncertain whether to match his pace or question his silence. He stopped a few feet short of Ethan Ward. The plaza stilled again. The tomb guard stood rifle-angled against his shoulder, eyes locked forward. He did not blink, did not move. Orlov's jaw worked, fighting words he didn't trust himself to say. And then, in a motion few expected, he lifted his right hand not in the Russian salute, but resting it over his heart. He held it there silent, a gesture of respect that spoke louder than any demand. Then without another word, he turned and walked away. Ethan didn't move, but inside his chest carried a new weight, heavier than the sun, heavier than the silence, a thread connecting him to Hayes, to Orlov, to something larger than any one man. The emblem still lay on the marble, its red star catching light. Claire Donovan zoomed in, capturing the symbol of arrogance turned into humility, and the soldier who hadn't budged an inch. The plaza never returned to its casual rhythm. Even as Colonel Orlov walked away, his aides shuffling behind him with uneasy glances, the air still held the crackle of what had just unfolded. Delegates whispered in clusters. Some murmured in disapproval at Orlov's arrogance, others spoke in admiration of Ethan Ward's composure. But in the center of it all, Ethan hadn't moved. Not when the Russian pinned his emblem on him, not when he brushed it off, not when his own voice, calm, unwavering, cut through the plaza with words about protocol and respect. He stood in his sacred silence, the weight of discipline holding him tighter than any chain. The emblem remained on the marble, a tiny red star glinting like a wound under the sun. Nobody dared pick it up. Not even Orlov, who had left it behind perhaps intentionally, perhaps in shame. Claire Donovan's camera didn't miss a second. She framed Ethan against the glaring sunlight, the emblem in the foreground, Orlov's retreat in the distance. The shot was perfect. Viral gold. Her reporter's instincts buzzed. This wasn't just a story, it was a symbol. She whispered into her phone's mic, almost to herself. Tomb guard refuses Russian colonel. Silence becomes defiance. A teacher hurried her group of school children toward the plaza's edge, though one freckle-faced boy kept twisting around for another look. He couldn't pull his eyes from Ethan. To him, the soldier wasn't a statue, he was alive with a kind of power that didn't need movement to be strong. At the fringe, Major Sarah Collins exhaled slowly, then stepped closer to Ethan, careful not to intrude. She wanted to check on him, but she knew better than to cross into the guard's perimeter. Instead, she stood at the line and spoke just loud enough for him to hear her voice low and steady. "Well done, Sergeant," she murmured. "Hold steady. You've carried it through." There was no response, there never would be, but she thought she saw a faint tightening of Ethan's jaw, the only acknowledgement possible. Colonel James Whitaker, standing a few feet back, watched with seasoned eyes. He knew what it took to face that kind of provocation. He had trained men to endure jeers, to hold discipline against the tug of instinct. But this had been something else. A foreign officer medals from wars that had scarred continents, pressing in with humiliation and threat, and Ethan had stood unshaken. Whitaker bent slightly, picked up the fallen emblem. He turned it in his palm, feeling the grooves of the tarnished star. A piece of history, yes, but one wielded like a weapon. He looked at Ethan, then at Collins, then slipped the emblem into his pocket. "We'll decide what to do with this later," he said softly. Collins nodded. "Thank you, sir." The plaza began to stir again. Delegates resumed their schedules with cautious glances over their shoulders. Security officers herded the crowd back to its flow. Yet the atmosphere was altered. The murmurs weren't idle anymore. They carried weight, respect, awe. Claire approached Collins, her phone still raised. "Major, care to comment on what just happened?" she asked, voice quick, hungry. Collins offered a professional smile. "No official comment at this time. But you've just seen why the tomb guard exists. That's all. It wasn't much, but it was enough." Claire's grin widened. She had her headline already. Meanwhile, Ethan's thoughts, hidden behind stone-still eyes, traveled inward. He wasn't proud. He wasn't relieved. He was anchored. Anchored to the tomb, to Reyes, to Hayes, to every soldier's name carved in stone. What had just happened wasn't about defying a colonel. It was about not betraying the silence he had sworn to keep. The sun burned hotter, sweat pooled at his collar. Still, he did not move. He would not move until relieved. And yet, deep inside, a shift had occurred. For years, he had carried the duty like a weight across his shoulders. Now, after Whitaker's revelation, he understood it as a bridge too between himself and Reyes, between Hayes and the Russian whose life he'd saved. The schoolboy, finally tugged away by his teacher, stole one last look over his shoulder. His eyes locked on Ethan, wide with wonder. He would tell the story later in halting words. "He didn't move, Mom. Not even when the Russian tried to make him. He didn't move at all. The moment wasn't just alive on phones and cameras. It had imprinted itself on living witnesses." Whitaker looked at Collins, his voice low. "This won't end here. That story is going to travel farther than any of us expect." Collins agreed. "Yes, sir." The world just watched silence win. The sun kept blazing. Ethan Ward did not falter. His rifle gleamed, his eyes locked forward, his body carved from resolve. The plaza had shifted, the air had changed, but his oath remained the same. He was the tomb guard, and not even the fury of a foreign colonel could alter that. The plaza's commotion thinned to a hum, but the aftershock stayed like heat that lingers in stone long after the sun slides behind a building. Colonel Dmitry Orlov was already halfway across the portico with his aides folding around him, their whispers skittering like dry leaves. Cameras drifted to other dignitaries, but nobody felt as if the moment was over. It had simply stepped off the stage and slipped behind the curtains where consequences are negotiated. Major Sarah Collins stood at the edge of Ethan Ward's invisible perimeter and let herself take one long, steady breath. Her pulse was still elevated, but the crisis had crested without spilling. She caught Colonel James Whitaker's eye. He gave a small nod, the kind old officers used to say both good work and not done yet. Collins picked up the nod and turned it into motion. "Sergeant," she said, voice pitched low for the guard's ears alone. "Relief inbound." Ethan didn't blink, didn't speak. The only sign that he'd heard was the smallest settling of breath. He stayed in his posture, duty locked in place, while a replacement guard in full dress approached from the colonnade with measured steps. The ceremony of the handoff unfolded with precise choreography, no haste, no deviation. The old guard's dignity asserted in the most powerful way it knew ritual performed perfectly. When Ethan finally stepped aside, the last residue of adrenaline found his knees. He hit it the way all practiced soldiers do, by giving it a task. He glanced once, only once, toward the place on the marble where the red star had lain. It was gone. He didn't need to look for it. He knew where it had gone. Whitaker had it. Good. Let the emblem live in someone else's pocket. Collins fell in beside him as he moved off the plaza. "Water," she said simply, and handed him a bottle as they entered the corridor of cool shade beneath the convention center's overhang. "Ma'am," Ethan said, voice formal but even. His throat was raw from heat, and a single sentence delivered like a verdict. They walked 10 paces without another word. Then a State Department liaison in a Navy suit intercepted them with the practiced glide of a man who has been taught to look unruffled even when the room is on fire. "Major Collins," he said. "Colonel Whitaker, we've set up a quick room." Whitaker appeared from the shadow as if the shade had shaped itself into him. "Where down the service hall?" "We should debrief while the ground's still warm." He flicked a glance toward Ethan. "Sergeant Ward, you're included." They wound through back corridors, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and coffee that had burned too long on a warmer. The room they were shown was a narrow conference box with no windows, beige walls, and a humming air conditioner that seemed to be doing penance for the plaza's sun. A carafe of water and a pyramid of paper cups waited on a tray as if someone had read the stage directions for tense meeting and dressed the set. Whitaker didn't sit. He placed the small emblem on the table with the care of a man setting down a live round. The red star looked dull under fluorescent light. The liaison closed the door. "All right," he said. "We contain this before it grows legs. Major Collins, walk me through." Collins gave him the facts. Timestamps, positions, words exactly as spoken. She did not add adjectives. She did not need to. Facts carry their own heat when stacked correctly. Sergeant Ward remained within protocol throughout, she concluded. He issued one statement regarding tomb guard standards after the Russian colonel placed an object on his uniform. The liaison rubbed a knuckle along his jaw. "We're going to hear about that. Moscow will frame it as an insult." Whitaker's voice was dry glass. He warned a man who trespassed on the dignity of a fallen soldier's uniform. "If Russia wants to argue that line, we'll take that argument." The door cracked open and a senior forum official, hair askew from too many sprints between too many fires, stepped in with a tablet. "Press is already chewing on it," she said. "We've got 3 different angles starting to trend: American statue embarrasses Russian officer, U.S. ceremony goes too far, and diplomatic humiliation on sacred ground. That last one's from a fringe outlet, but it'll travel." "Claire Donovan's footage?" Collins asked. "Uploading on 2 platforms," the official said. "Her copy's balanced so far. She's good. We can't control that wave, but at least the headline isn't a flamethrower." The liaison exhaled through his nose. "Moscow embassy reached out," the official said. "They're concerned about inappropriate behavior toward a senior Russian officer. They want an acknowledgement, maybe an apology, maybe a statement that this was a misunderstanding." Whitaker tapped the emblem with one finger, a single soft tick. "They can have a statement," he said. "They cannot have an apology." The liaison lifted both palms in a truce gesture. "Let's be deliberate. Colonel, you mentioned Afghanistan outside. Are you prepared to put that on the record?" Whitaker's gaze held. "If it prevents this from hardening into something uglier than it needs to be." The truth is not classified. A U.S. soldier saved Orlov's life. That soldier is dead. The unit that guards his memory is what Sergeant Ward carried onto that plaza. The official's eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "If we say it, it had better be sourced." Name was Sergeant Daniel Hayes, Whitaker said. KIA 2009. "I can get you the file. I can get you his CO's letter to his family." "Mine." Silence landed in the room and unpacked its bag. The liaison swallowed once and nodded. "We'll draft language." "We honor the fallen. The tomb guard's discipline is devotion, not defiance." Something like that. Collins' phone vibrated. She glanced an alert from an internal channel, not press. "Heads up, Russian delegation drafting letter of protest to forum director, demanding appropriate respect acknowledgement." She slid the phone across the table. "There it is." Whitaker looked at Ethan for the first time since they entered. "You did right," he said, voice low. "You did the job the way it's supposed to be done." "Thank you, sir," Ethan said. "Eat something?" Whitaker added, which was an order disguised as concern. The liaison gathered his notes. "We'll keep the statement soft but resolute," he said. "We're not turning this into a headline war with Moscow. Let the pictures speak, let the silence speak louder." He squared the stack of papers no one had used. "And keep that emblem somewhere safe. If the Russians decide to make a symbol of it, I'd rather it be in our custody." Whitaker slid the star back into his pocket. "It's safe." The meeting dissolved into movement. Collins paused at the door, waited for Ethan to catch up, and then matched his pace down the corridor. "You good?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Any injuries?" "No, ma'am." She almost smiled. "The answer you give medics, huh?" A corner of Ethan's mouth twitched. "Yes, ma'am." They stepped into the green room outside the main assembly hall where diplomats milled under muted chandeliers, faces arranged into diplomatic neutrality. Across the carpet, Ethan caught a slice of his reflection in a pane of smoked glass cap. Straight lines, crisp, a soldier backlit by the shape of a complicated day. He felt the weight of it in his shoulders, not as burden, but as confirmation. He had not wavered. A vibration thumbed in his pocket. He checked the name Mom. He stared at it for a second, then let it roll to voicemail. There are calls you take later when your breathing matches the world again. Outside, a black sedan door thunked shut. Inside, Dmitry Orlov sat with his hands braced on his knees, elbows crooked like a man about to leap or pray. His aides watched him as one watches a storm, respectful distance, eyes averted. Orlov looked down at the empty space on his chest, where a star might have glowed. He could still feel the pin's metal edge against the American's coat, could still hear the clink of it striking marble. Shame is a funny metal. It hums under the skin. His phone lit with a Moscow number. He let it ring once, twice, then answered in a tone engineered for control. The conversation was brief, more silence than words. When he hung up, he said, without looking at anyone, "Draft the letter." Then, after a beat, "Make it." Measured. Measured tasted unfamiliar in his mouth. Back inside, Claire Donovan anchored herself by a pillar and typed with a speed born from too many breaking stories and too little sleep. The first cut of her video finished processing. She watched the opening frame, the Russian's hand lifting the emblem gleaming, the American's hand removing it with a machine's delicacy. She added one line before she hit publish. Sometimes the strongest answer is the one that doesn't move. Her phone pulsed immediately, like shares a DM from her editor with 3 fire emojis, and "You just bought us tomorrow's traffic." She ignored the dopamine flicker. She was already writing the follow-up, the one about Daniel Hayes. She'd need quotes, a photo. Something that made the internet remember this wasn't theater. It was lineage. Ethan took a moment alone in a dim service alcove where an ice machine thrummed like distant thunder. He pressed the cold bottle against the back of his neck and closed his eyes. For 10 seconds, he let the plaza dissolve. The tomb rose up in its place, marble shade, the metronome of steps that had taught him a language without words. He heard Reyes laugh, a solar flare of memory, then saw the white arc of blast light that followed it. The breath went out of him and came back steady. He opened his eyes and straightened. On the way back to the floor, he passed Colonel Whitaker, pausing under a sconce, studying a framed photograph of a previous forum. Whitaker didn't look up as he said, "The world is loud, Sergeant. Your job is to be the quiet that makes sense of it." "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "And when they ask you tomorrow if you were angry, remember this: anger is for men who have not yet learned what to carry." Ethan stood a fraction taller. Understood. They returned to the brightness of the atrium where protocols stitched the day back together. Outside, motorcades released and swallowed men in suits. Inside, a nation's ritual reset its jaw. Somewhere between those two currents, a red star rode in a retired colonel's pocket. Somewhere else, a phone uploaded a story that had no villains and yet judged everyone. And on a line of marble across the river, 21 silent steps waited for the only answer that had ever mattered. Night draped itself over Washington with a heat that refused to break. The streets glowed with sodium lamps and the red and blue strobes of diplomatic escorts peeling away from the International Security Forum. But for those who had witnessed the clash in the plaza, the day wasn't done. Colonel Dmitry Orlov sat in the back of his sedan, his posture stiff as the leather seat groaned beneath him. The city slid past his window in blurs of monuments and lights. His aides sat silent, not daring to prod his thoughts. In Orlov's chest there was no triumph, only the echo of that metallic clink, the sound of his emblem hitting marble and being swept aside with surgical precision. He replayed the American's voice. "Maintain distance and respect my duty." The words were calm, but to him they had landed like a strike. He closed his eyes. The day had peeled back something he kept buried. The road outside Kunduz. The smoke. The fire. the weight of another man dragging him through the blast shrapnel slicing air. He remembered hands gripping his vest hands that belonged to a man who didn't live long enough to speak again. He had never known the soldier's name. Now Whitaker had given it Sergeant Daniel Hayes. Orlov exhaled a low rasp. He hated debts. He hated remembering. Yet debts do not vanish because a man pretends they aren't there. Across town, Ethan Ward sat alone in his barracks room, a bottle of water sweating on the desk beside him. He'd been relieved from duty hours earlier, debriefed, dismissed, and told to rest. But rest didn't come easy. The room felt too still after the weight of that plaza. He stripped his jacket and laid it flat on the chair, his eyes tracing the spot on the shoulder where the emblem had touched. He ran a finger along the fabric. It was immaculate again, no mark left behind. But he felt the weight anyway, as if some part of that red star had burned into him. He thought of Hayes. He had known the name, yes, every tomb guard did, but not the story Whitaker had spoken. Hayes dead in Afghanistan after pulling Orlov from the fire. It connected Ethan's silence today with a thread he hadn't realized he was carrying. He whispered the name to himself, a prayer spoken in the quiet of an empty room. Hayes. Meanwhile, Major Sarah Collins typed her report, in the late hours the glow of her laptop painting her face pale blue. She was precise, recounting the incident line by line, leaving nothing to speculation. Yet at the bottom she added something not asked for a personal note. Sergeant Ward did not flinch. In silence he embodied devotion to the fallen. The crowd witnessed not defiance, but discipline that cannot be bent. She hesitated before hitting send, then did. Colonel Whitaker sat at his own kitchen table miles away, the tarnished star resting on the wood before him. His house was quiet, filled only with the distant hum of traffic and the creak of old boards. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, but it sat untouched. He turned the emblem over in his palm, seeing both insult and history inside its grooves. He thought of Hayes, the boy who had volunteered young, who had stood at the tomb with the same discipline as Ethan before deploying. He remembered the letter he had written to Hayes's parents. Words that never felt enough. Now, all these years later, Hayes had spoken again, not with his voice, but through silence kept by another. The world, however, was not silent. By midnight, Claire Donovan's footage had gone viral, shared by veterans groups, reposted by journalists, debated by talking heads, who hadn't been there but spoke as if they had. The clip spread across continents, the Russian colonel pressing his emblem, the tomb guard brushing it away, the measured warning about protocol. Millions watched. Millions argued. Was it insult? Was it devotion? Was it politics dressed as ceremony? Claire sat in her apartment phone, buzzing with endless notifications, her laptop alive with emails from editors. But she ignored them all. She replayed the footage one more time, frame by frame, studying Ethan Ward's stillness. She whispered what she hadn't dared print yet. That's not just a soldier. That's a living monument. The next morning, Orlov's letter of protest landed on the forum director's desk. It was measured as he'd ordered, but the words were sharp. We demand acknowledgement of inappropriate behavior toward a senior officer of the Russian Federation. Respect between soldiers is universal, and it was denied. Whitaker read the letter hours later, lips pressed tight. He folded it once, slid it aside, and drafted his own response. His words were simple. The tomb guard does not answer to individuals. His duty is to the fallen. Silence is not disrespect, it is devotion. The forum's staff debated whether to release Whitaker's account publicly. Collins argued for transparency. The liaison argued for caution, but the story had already escaped their grasp. The crowd had seen, the cameras had captured, and the silence had spoken for itself. That evening, Orlov stood before his hotel mirror, adjusting his uniform. His chest felt heavier without the star. He stared at his reflection, the lines etched deep from years of conflict, and muttered, Hayes. The name tasted foreign. He pressed his palm over his heart, a gesture he had seen Ethan inspire in him against his will. His aides knocked on the door, reminding him of dinner with delegates. He ignored them for a moment longer, staring at the ghost in the mirror. Across the river, Ethan walked the marble of Arlington again, this time alone, not in duty, but in pilgrimage. The tomb glowed under the moonlight. He placed a hand against the stone fingers, brushing words carved into eternity, known but to God. He bowed his head, whispering the name once more. Hayes. Duty bound the living to the dead. And for Ethan Ward, silence had become more than ritual. It was a bridge one that reached even into the heart of a Russian colonel who had thought himself untouchable. Morning broke over Washington. The sky streaked in pale orange as convoys of black SUVs carried the delegations back to the convention center for the second day of the forum. The city looked calm on the surface, but beneath it hummed with a nervous energy. The confrontation between Colonel Dmitry Orlov and the American Tomb Guard had already spread across the globe. Every delegate walking into the hall that morning carried an opinion shaped not by whispers in backrooms, but by a 30-second video that had traveled faster than any official communique. In his barracks, Ethan Ward sat at the edge of his bunk, his uniform freshly pressed boots shined to a mirror finish. He hadn't slept much, though. Fatigue never showed in his bearing. He had read nothing online, but he didn't need to. The way fellow soldiers looked at him in the hallway, quiet nods, a touch more respect in the set of their shoulders, told him the story had reached them. Ethan never sought the spotlight, but the spotlight had found him. He straightened his collar, whispered the name again. Hayes, and let the sound center him. At the forum, Major Sarah Collins walked the marble corridors, tablet in hand. Updates flashed across her screen. Clash at forum, trending worldwide, silent guard. Stirs, debate, respect, or defiance. Russian-U.S. confrontation. She pursed her lips and kept moving. These weren't just headlines, they were sparks waiting for fuel. Her job was to keep them from igniting. She spotted Colonel James Whitaker already in the hall, silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers. He had spent his morning fielding calls from both the Pentagon and State Department. Some officials wanted to smooth things over, others wanted to lean into the symbolism. Whitaker believed in neither. He believed in truth. And the truth was simple. Sergeant Hayes had saved Orlov's life. The Tomb Guard had honored Hayes. That was the story that mattered. Morning, Colonel Collins said, stepping beside him. Morning, Whitaker replied. His voice was calm, but his eyes tracked the room like a man reading wind patterns before a storm. The Russians filed their protest officially, and he gave a dry half smile. And the State Department is trying to decide whether we light a candle or a fuse. Collins exhaled. At least Claire Donovan's coverage has been balanced. Her report last night tied it to Hayes. Veterans groups are flooding social media with his photo. It's changing the narrative. Whitaker nodded once. Good. Let it be about Hayes, not about Orlov's pride. Meanwhile, Orlov himself sat in his hotel suite, the curtains drawn against the morning sun. His aides had laid out his uniform, again crisp metals aligned, but the chest felt bare to him without the emblem. He traced the spot with his finger, remembering the American's gloved hand, brushing it off. That memory cut sharper than any insult. He had been briefed by Moscow at dawn. Their message had been blunt: reclaim the narrative. Do not allow humiliation to stand. But Orlov found himself staring at the coffee on the table, untouched, his mind elsewhere on Hayes, on fire, on hands dragging him from death. He whispered the name again. Hayes. His aides heard it and exchanged uneasy looks, but they didn't dare ask. Back at the forum, the crowd thickened in the central plaza once more. Delegations filed through security press, pressed close to barricades, and the buzz of speculation filled the humid air. At the center of it, Ethan Ward stood again, motionless, in his black uniform, rifle steady at his shoulder. The plaza seemed to tilt toward him, gravity bending around his silence. The freckle-faced schoolboy from yesterday had returned with his class. He tugged at his teacher's sleeve, whispering, "That's him, the one who didn't move." The teacher shushed him, but her own eyes lingered on Ethan with quiet pride. Claire Donovan hovered at the edge phone, raised, her expression thoughtful. She wasn't just filming anymore, she was documenting a story that had already outgrown her. And then Orlov entered the plaza. He strode forward, aides trailing, his jaw tight, but his pace slower than yesterday's. The crowd stirred, whispers rising like a tide. Cameras swung to catch every angle. The tension returned instantly, humming in the air like the low vibration of a distant storm. He stopped several feet from Ethan, the same spot where his arrogance had flared only a day earlier. The silence pressed down heavy. For a heartbeat, everyone waited for history to repeat itself. But this time Orlov did not smirk. He did not raise his hand in mockery. He simply stood staring at the guard's unblinking eyes. He inhaled sharply, straightened his shoulders, and then did something no one expected. He placed his right hand over his heart. The gesture was quiet, restrained, but it carried weight. A Russian gesture of respect not demanded, not forced, given freely. He held it there for several long seconds, the cameras capturing every frame. The crowd murmured, not in shock this time, but in awe. Ethan didn't move. He couldn't. His oath was stillness. But inside, something stirred. He had heard Whitaker's words, had learned Hayes' story, and now he saw its ripple across nations, across enemies, across time. Orlov dropped his hand, turned, and walked away. His aides scrambled to follow. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reverent. Claire Donovan lowered her phone, slowly whispering, "That's the story. That's the turn." And Ethan, though motionless, felt the truth of it settle deep inside. This wasn't just about a clash of pride anymore. It was about memory sacrifice and a thread binding men who should have been enemies, but were by blood and fire forever connected. The world had just watched it happen through the silence of a tomb guard who never moved. The sun had already climbed high by the time the delegations filed back inside for another day of negotiations. The plaza emptied little by little until only the faint scuff of shoes and the chatter of tourists remained. But the echoes of what had just happened lingered, Colonel Dmitry Orlov placing his hand over his heart before turning away. For those who had seen it, the gesture weighed more than any speech inside the conference hall. Ethan Ward hadn't moved an inch, but in his stillness he felt the ripple. Inside, beneath the armor of discipline, something shifted. He wasn't thinking about cameras or the journalists who had captured the moment. He wasn't thinking about Russia or the United States. He was thinking about Hayes, about a soldier he'd never met, whose life and death had bridged nations, whose memory now breathed in every step Ethan took at the tomb and every moment he stood guard in silence. Major Sarah Collins watched the crowd disperse. Her heart slowed, though her pulse still drummed from the confrontation. She had seen men try to bend moments to their will before, but never had she seen a moment bend a man the way it had bent Orlov. She approached Whitaker, who stood quietly off to the side, hands behind his back, gaze lingering on Ethan. "You think this will hold?" she asked softly. Whitaker's silver brows lifted slightly. "For now. Pride doesn't vanish in a day. But sometimes a seed gets planted where no one expects it. That gesture." He shook his head. It wasn't for us. It was for himself. A way of admitting something without saying the words. Collins exhaled, following his gaze. Ethan stood motionless, eyes fixed forward. He looked like a statue, but Collins knew better. Inside, he was carrying the weight of generations. Nearby, Claire Donovan tucked her phone into her bag, her expression thoughtful. She'd captured everything, but she didn't rush to publish this time. She wanted to get it right. Her earlier video had already exploded online, millions of views overnight, comments flooding in from veterans, families, and civilians around the world. Some called Ethan a hero, others argued about politics, but almost all agreed what they had seen was extraordinary. Now, with Orlov's unexpected gesture, she sensed the story had turned into something even bigger. She whispered to herself as she scribbled notes. Yesterday, confrontation. Today, acknowledgement. Tomorrow, maybe reconciliation. Ethan's relief arrived shortly after another guard stepping in with crisp precision. The handoff was seamless, a dance rehearsed 1,000 times. Ethan finally broke posture, turning with measured steps, his boots striking the marble with deliberate weight. Each strike echoed not just his discipline, but the meaning of what he had just endured. When he stepped behind the lines, Collins was waiting. "You all right?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said, voice even. "You held the line," she said. Ethan only nodded. To speak more felt unnecessary. Whitaker approached, producing the tarnished star from his pocket. He held it in his palm, the red catching faint glints of light. "This doesn't belong to us," he said, "but it's ours for now, until the right moment comes." Ethan looked at the emblem, then back at Whitaker. "It belongs with Hayes," he said quietly. Whitaker's eyes softened. "Maybe one day." That evening, the story dominated headlines. Networks replayed the footage endlessly. Orlov's demand, Ethan's silence, the brushing away of the emblem, and finally the Russian colonel placing his hand over his heart. Analysts debated motives. Politicians tried to twist it to their causes. But veterans groups didn't bother with politics. They saw only a tomb guard doing his duty. and a foreign officer finally recognizing it. Claire's article dropped just before midnight. The headline read, "In silence, he spoke tomb guard. Honors the fallen Russian colonel responds." It wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about memory honor and an unexpected threat of respect. Across the ocean, the article was translated into Russian, then into German, Japanese, and Mandarin. Comments flooded in from readers who had never heard of the tomb of the unknown soldier before now asking to know more. Some debated politics, yes, but others wrote stories of their own family members lost in wars, names etched in memorials, candles lit in windows. Back in his hotel room, Orlov scrolled through an article in Russian about the incident. His aides hovered nearby tense. But Orlov wasn't angry, not anymore. His gaze lingered on a single photo, Ethan Ward standing like stone rifle at his shoulder, the emblem at his feet. He traced the image with a finger, whispered again. "Hayes." The aides exchanged confused glances, but said nothing. For the first time in years, their commander looked not arrogant, but human. Meanwhile, Ethan made his way to Arlington after his shift. The evening sun painted the marble in gold as he walked toward the tomb. He moved with the same reverence as when he was on duty, though tonight he was alone. He placed a hand against the cool stone, letting his fingers trace the words carved deep, known but to God. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Hayes, we still carry you." A breeze stirred through the cemetery, soft and solemn, as though answering. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive. The following morning, Washington awoke not to the usual hum of politics, but to the echo of a story that had swept the globe overnight. Every major outlet ran it. Some headlines shouted, "Silent American soldier defies Russian colonel." Others leaned softer. When silence speaks louder than words. On social media, the video looped endlessly. Viewers from Berlin to Manila replayed the moment the emblem clinked on marble, then the stillness that followed. Others clipped the frame where Orlov pressed his hand to his heart, an image that already carried the gravity of history. In the barracks, Ethan Ward sat on the edge of his cot boots, laced uniform immaculate. His phone buzzed on the desk beside him. He had ignored most of the noise texts from distant relatives, missed calls from old platoon friends, emails stacked with subject lines like, "You're a hero." He didn't feel like one. He felt like a man who had simply done what he had sworn to do. The door creaked open. It was Major Sarah Collins, coffee in hand. She stepped inside, her expression softer than her usual professional edge. "You've become famous overnight," she said, half smiling. Ethan shook his head. I stood still. "Sometimes that's enough," Collins replied. She handed him the coffee. "You earned this more than I did." He accepted it, murmuring, "Thank you, ma'am." Collins studied him for a moment, then said, "The Pentagon's watching. The White House, too. They're debating whether to issue a statement." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "With respect, ma'am, I hope they don't." This wasn't about politics. Her smile widened a fraction. "You sound like Whitaker." Across town, Colonel James Whitaker sat at a long oak table in the Old Guard's headquarters. The tarnished red star lay before him, a relic that had passed through too many hands. A group of officers listened as Whitaker spoke, his voice carrying the patience of years. This emblem, he said, was meant as an insult. Instead, it became something else. Proof that silence and discipline carry power greater than pride. Sergeant Ward carried it. Hayes carried it before him. And that is what the world saw. The officers nodded, understanding. One asked, "What do we do with the emblem now, sir?" Whitaker looked down at it, fingers brushing its cold surface. "We hold on to it. For now. Until the right moment comes." Meanwhile, in a quiet hotel room, Dmitry Orlov sat in silence. He had dismissed his aides for the morning, sending them to meetings without him. He sat at the desk, a notebook open before him, pen in hand. He wrote slowly in Russian the name he had learned only days ago, Sergeant Daniel Hayes. He wrote it 3 times each time, pressing harder as though carving it into his own memory. For years he had buried the face of the soldier who pulled him from fire. Now that face had a name, and the name had weight. It haunted him, yes, but it also steadied him. He whispered it once quietly and sat back in the chair. Hayes. At Arlington, Ethan returned again after duty. He walked the familiar paths, his boots clicking softly against the stone. The tomb glowed beneath the fading sun. A new guard paced the 21 steps, the rhythm steady and sacred. Ethan stopped a few feet back, removed his cap, and bowed his head. He traced the words with his eyes. Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God. Each time he read them, they seemed to hold more meaning. This time Hayes' name was there too, etched invisibly beside the unknown. Nearby, a small crowd had gathered, some tourists, some veterans in faded caps, hands pressed to hearts. They had seen the footage, read the headlines, and come here to witness what it meant. One elderly veteran leaning on a cane murmured to his grandson, "That's why they never move. Not for men like Orlov, for the ones we buried here." Ethan heard the words, though he gave no sign. They reinforced what he already knew. His silence had spoken for Hayes, for Reyes, for all the names carved into stone, and for the names never known. Back at her apartment, Claire Donovan wrote her second article. The first had gone viral. This one would cement the story. She typed, "When a Russian colonel demanded a salute, a U.S. tomb guard gave him something greater: silence. Behind that silence is a lineage, men like Sergeant Daniel Hayes, who saved lives in Afghanistan and rests now in Arlington. Yesterday wasn't a clash. It was a reminder that duty, devotion, and sacrifice speak louder than words." She hit publish. By nightfall, messages flooded Ethan's inbox again. Some were from strangers, others from fellow soldiers. One email stood out. "My brother was Hayes' roommate at Fort Myer. Thank you for carrying his name today. You honored him." Ethan read it twice, then closed the screen. He whispered again softly, "Hayes." Silence filled the room, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was peace. By mid-morning, the story had outrun Washington. It was on breakfast tables in Ohio, and apartments in Warsaw, on coach buses rolling through Bavaria, and in a subway car rattling beneath Tokyo. A 30-second clip, an emblem glinting in the sun, a tomb guard brushing it away with immaculate calm, had become the world's coffee. And the refill came in the form of a single still frame, a Russian colonel with his palm pressed over his heart. Claire Donovan hadn't slept much. The little apartment off U Street felt like a command post, 2 laptops open, a charger octopus spreading across the floor, half a mug of cold coffee surrendering on the desk. The first story was already big. The second, about Hayes, had detonated in a quieter, deeper way. Her inbox held notes that didn't read like internet shouting. They read like folded letters. A Marine from Fallujah wrote to say, "I hated your profession until this morning. Thank you for telling it straight." A woman from Tulsa attached a photo of her grandfather at a World War II memorial. A Russian émigré added a line in careful English, "Respect is a language not needing translator." "Claire, you're live in 7, her editor said through the phone, his voice already 2 coffees ahead. "Morning show wants you to hit 3 points. What happened? Who Hayes was and why it matters. Keep it clean. Keep it human. No label fights." She dragged on a blazer, pinned her mic, and steadied the camera on a stack of cookbooks. "Got it," she said. And when the producer counted her down, she told it like she'd seen it. A provocation met with discipline, an emblem used like a weapon, a silence that wasn't empty. She said Hayes' name twice. She never once said the word humiliation. Across town, a different kind of quiet rolled over the old guard's headquarters. Hallway chatter dimmed when Ethan Ward passed. Not because people didn't know what to say, but because they knew he didn't need it. He signed a routine form, returned a cap to a rack, glanced at a wall where frames held the regiment's history in sepia and black and white guards in raincapes and snow at midnight, at noon. Every one of them stillness shaped into duty. He touched nothing. He kept moving. Major Sarah Collins kept 2 screens open at her desk, one on internal channels, notes from the forum, director at the embassy, the Pentagon, and one on a curated social feed where the noise came filtered through credibility. She watched the narrative wobble and settle like a top. It had started as a clash. Now it was landing somewhere else. Veterans groups had added ballast threads about ritual, about why the tomb exists, about how the word ceremonial doesn't mean performative, it means sacred. She felt a knot in her chest begin to loosen. "Ma'am," a young specialist said from the doorway, tapping the frame. "Press office is asking whether Sergeant Ward will do interviews." Negative, Collins said without looking up. He won't. He can't. And he shouldn't. Understood. She did look up, then softening it. Send them the line, we agreed. The tomb guard's voice is in his footsteps. That's all. Yes, ma'am. Colonel James Whitaker stepped in a few minutes later with the unhurried gait of someone who refuses to be rushed by the news cycle. He set the tarnished red star on her desk blotter. It looked wrong anywhere but in a pocket, or on a uniform a noise where silence belonged. They'll ask for it back, Collins said. They can... Whitaker replied. We'll return it when it means the right thing, and if they try to make it a rallying flag... Whitaker's mouth made a line. Then we'll let a marble plaza and a 30-second clip do the arguing. The world saw what it saw. He didn't add the rest that most arguments worth winning are won without a raised voice. At a small newsroom in Arlington, a volunteer for a Gold Star family nonprofit hit publish on a post with a photo of Hayes laughing in a chow tent, sleeves rolled eyes, impossibly young. The caption read, "He pulled men from fire and didn't come home. Remember his name when you watch that video?" The post didn't go viral in the fireworks way. It moved like an underground river. People shared it with 2 words for Hayes. Ethan avoided the internet the way a man avoids a mirror when he's trying to hear other things. He cleaned a rifle that didn't need cleaning. He squared edges that were already right angles. When a captain stuck his head into the armory and said, "Ward, got a minute?" Ethan rose. The office was tidy, in an old army way hard chair, soft lamp, a framed print of Arlington in winter. The captain kept it simple. "The regiment's proud," he said. "So am I. That won't change how we do things." "Understood." "Yes, sir." "You'll get calls, ignore them. You'll get praise. Let it pass through you. You'll get criticism. Let it pass too." "Yes, sir." The captain hesitated, then added, "If you need a day, take one." Ethan shook his head. "I'd rather work." "Good," the captain said, and something at the corner of his mouth tried to be a smile. "Me too." In a suite at the Willard, Dmitry Orlov stood at the window, a triangle of the Washington Monument, visible, above the trees, as sharp and white as a drawn blade. Russian television chattered from the room's corner, commentators trying to bend the story back to familiar curves. Words like insult and American arrogance fell like furniture down a stairwell. He muted it. His aides had placed a map of the city on the desk with a neat blue circle around Arlington. He hadn't asked for it. They knew him well enough to know what the map meant. Sir One said carefully, "Moscow would like to see a stronger statement," later Orlov said without inflection. "They also..." The aide faltered. "They suggest you do not." He nodded toward the map. "Go there." Orlov's face changed in no visible way, but the temperature in the room shifted. "I will go as I choose," he said, "and I will go as a soldier." The aide bowed his head. "Yes, Colonel." When the aides left, Orlov took out a notebook and wrote in a slow, steady hand, "Kunduz. Ambush. Heat. Hands on vest. Hayes." He underlined the last word, then closed the book and slipped it into his inside pocket like a small square promise. Claire's phone buzzed with a new message. "This is Marie Hayes, Daniel's mother. I would like to speak if it helps people remember my son as a person, not a symbol." Claire stared at the screen for a long breath, then called. She didn't record. She listened. Mrs. Hayes spoke about a boy who ran cross-country and tied his shoes twice, about a first salute, about the day he shipped out with a smile meant to make it easier on everyone else. She cried once, a small private sound, and Claire did not fill it with anything. When they hung up, Claire wrote a paragraph that felt like a prayer. By afternoon, the forum's director circulated a draft statement. Collins read the words with a pen in her hand but didn't use it. "We reaffirm our respect for the traditions of all nations represented here. We also recognize the unique role of the United States Army Tomb Guard in honoring the fallen of all wars. The events witnessed yesterday should be understood in that light. It was careful. It was enough. Send it," she said. And then, as sometimes happens in the city, the day softened around the edges. Sunlight lengthened over the Potomac. A motorcade purred down Constitution Avenue with less urgency than the day before. Tourists took photos in front of fountains. The world kept doing what it does when it has been given something decent to think about. Ethan folded into the evening the only way he knew, boots on familiar stone hands at perfect angles, breath measured to the metronome of footsteps that belonged to no single man. He took his place for a short relief shift to cover a sick guard, not because anyone asked, but because he'd asked himself. The first turn gave him the answer he hadn't realized he wanted. The job felt the same. Whatever the city was saying about him, the tomb stayed what it had always been, an address where nations come to tell the truth without speaking. On the plaza beyond the cemetery's gates, an older couple held hands and said nothing for a long time. A teenager set his phone down out of respect and discovered what quiet sounds like. A Russian tourist with a guidebook in Cyrillic stood apart and wiped at his eyes with a knuckle, embarrassed at the betrayal of water. When Ethan's relief came, Major Collins was waiting just beyond the line as she had been since the first day. "Evening, Sergeant," she said. "Ma'am?" "World's calmer today." "Yes, ma'am." They walked toward the gate together. The air had lost its bite. A breeze moved through the oaks with a sound like pages turning. "You'll hear something soon," she said. "Not press. A request." She didn't explain. He didn't ask. At the bottom of the hill, Colonel Whitaker stood with his hands behind his back, looking not at the tomb, but at the people looking at it. He reached into his pocket and touched the red star just once, and made a decision he didn't announce. Some things you prepare for by being ready when the knock comes. Behind them, in a car cutting across Memorial Bridge, Dmitry Orlov watched Arlington rise from the green like a ship's prow. He did not speak. He let the silence be the first step across the distance he had made for himself. And somewhere in the city, Claire hit publish on a third story, one that began not with a confrontation, but with a kitchen table and a mother's memory. He tied his shoes twice. The sun set over Arlington like a slow procession. The marble caught the last gold of day and held it glowing as if lit from within. Across the river, Washington's lights flickered alive one by one, but here silence reigned. The tomb of the unknown soldier was as it had always been, eternal, unmoved, watching over the city that bustled below. Ethan Ward had returned to his quarters after his relief shift, but his thoughts were still here. The silence clung to him like a second skin. He stretched out his uniform jacket on the chair, brushing a hand across the shoulder where the Russian emblem had once rested. No mark remained, but Ethan felt it anyway, like an invisible scar. In the command office, Colonel James Whitaker stood with Major Sarah Collins reviewing the day's storm of reports. Whitaker laid the tarnished red star on the table again. The light caught the grooves in its metal, but this time it looked different, not like a weapon, but like a relic. "They'll want this back," Collins said, her tone cautious. "They can ask." Whitaker replied, voice gravel deep. "But it belongs to a moment now, and that moment belongs to us." Collins nodded slowly. "The press is still hounding for interviews. Donovan's stories are everywhere. Veterans groups are holding vigils tonight in Hayes' name. It's spreading, sir, farther than any of us imagined." Whitaker allowed himself a faint smile. "Then Hayes is remembered. That's the point." Meanwhile, in his barracks, Ethan scrolled past the noise on his phone, emails, social posts, praise that didn't feel like his to claim. He paused at one message: "I was Hayes' cousin. Thank you for carrying him yesterday." Ethan read it 3 times before locking the phone and setting it aside. He whispered Hayes' name into the dark as if it were a prayer. Across town, Dmitry Orlov sat in his hotel suite. Ty loosened his aids, dismissed for the night. He had poured himself vodka, but hadn't touched it. Instead, he held his notebook, staring at the word written on the page, Hayes. His lips moved silently, repeating it. He thought of the soldier dragging him through smoke and fire. He thought of the tomb guard's silent defiance, a mirror of devotion he had once mocked. And he thought of his own pride, brittle now, stripped of its armor. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and murmured, "I owe you." His voice cracked. He did not say it as a colonel. He said it as a man. Claire Donovan filed her 3rd story just before midnight. The headline was stark: "The guard who spoke without moving." She wrote about Ethan Ward not as a hero, but as a vessel, someone who embodied duty so purely that it silenced arrogance without raising his voice. She tied it again to Hayes, weaving in the story of his sacrifice. By dawn, the piece had traveled into languages she couldn't read, shared by strangers across continents who recognized something universal in silence and honor. At the Pentagon, senior officials debated how to handle the firestorm. Some wanted to exploit it to declare victory in the court of opinion. Others counseled restraint. But when Colonel Whitaker was asked for his recommendation, his answer was simple: do nothing. Let the silence hold. By morning, veterans groups had taken up the call. Candlelight vigils spread across the country. In small towns and big cities, people gathered at memorials whispering names of their own lost soldiers. A phrase began trending for Hayes. At Arlington that afternoon, Ethan returned once more, not in duty but in devotion. He stood at the tomb, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the words carved into stone, known but to God. He felt the presence of all those names unseen, and among them Hayes. He whispered again, "We remember you." Behind him, Whitaker approached slowly, stopping a few paces back. He didn't speak at first, simply stood with Ethan in the silence. Then, after a long moment, he said quietly, "You carried yourself well, and you carried him." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Sir, I only stood still." Whitaker placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes stillness is the loudest thing a man can do." Across the river, Orlov stared out of his hotel window at the city's glow. His aides returned with news Moscow wanted a harder stance. He ignored them. Instead, he traced the map of Arlington with his finger circling the tomb's location. Soon he murmured, "I will go. Alone." And in that vow whispered to no one but himself, Orlov took his first step towards something he never thought possible: reconciliation with a debt he had buried in fire. The city woke under a humid haze, a pale sun rising through a film of cloud. Washington's rhythm felt slower, as though the weight of yesterday's story still hung in the air. Yet beneath the surface, conversations were happening in quiet rooms and embassy offices in the Pentagon and across the ocean in Moscow. For Ethan Ward, the morning was like any other. He rose before dawn, pressed his uniform, polished his boots until they gleamed like glass. He tied every thread into place, checked every angle twice, then walked to his post with the same rhythm he always had. But inside, he knew the world was no longer treating him like any other tomb guard. He had become the still figure on screens across the world, the man who stood silent when demanded to bow. In the press offices, Claire Donovan's stories continued to gather momentum. News outlets begged for interviews with Ethan, but she knew they'd never get one. She told her editor, "That's the beauty of it. His silence is the story." Her latest article, woven with quotes from Hayes' family, had lit something deeper than outrage or spectacle. It had touched grief, memory, and pride. People who had never heard of the tomb before now wrote letters sharing the names of their own lost loved ones. At the Old Guard headquarters, Colonel Whitaker stood in his office, the tarnished star resting in his palm. He had spent much of the night turning it over, wondering if it belonged in a museum or on a desk or in a drawer. He knew where it truly belonged, but the moment hadn't come yet. For now, he kept it close. He would be its custodian until its meaning finished its work. Major Sarah Collins entered with a fresh report. Russian delegation just confirmed they're staying until the end of the form. No walkout. Whitaker's eyes flicked to her. And Orlov. She hesitated. Quiet. Almost too quiet. Whitaker slipped the star back into his pocket. Quiet men are the ones you watch the closest. He's not done with this. Across town, Orlov sat in his hotel room, his aides fidgeting around him. He had ignored half a dozen calls from Moscow, dismissing them with a raised hand. His eyes stayed fixed on the small map of Arlington still lying open on the desk. He had circled the tomb's location the night before. Now he stared at it as though it were a battlefield yet to be crossed. Sir, one aide began carefully, "Moscow insists you keep this diplomatic. They prefer statements, not visits." Orlov didn't look up. "Moscow prefers pride. I prefer truth." The aide faltered. "With respect, Colonel," the optics, Orlov cut him off with a glare sharp enough to silence him. "The optics will be what they are. I will see the tomb before I leave this city." The aide bowed his head and stepped back. That evening, Arlington was quiet again. The public had thinned the air heavy with the scent of cut grass. Ethan was off duty, yet he found himself walking toward the tomb as the sky bruised purple with twilight. He paused a few feet away, cap under his arm, his boots silent on the stone. He felt it before he saw it, the presence of another man standing not far away, hands clasped behind his back, posture rigid but not ceremonial. When Ethan turned, he recognized him instantly. Colonel Orlov. No cameras, no aides, just two men, one in the uniform of the old guard, the other in the uniform of Russia, standing on sacred ground. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was its own weight. The guard on duty continued his measured 21 steps, turning on perfect cadence, oblivious to the storm of meaning playing out a few feet away. Finally, Orlov moved. He stepped closer to the tomb, removed his cap, and pressed his hand to his heart. His lips moved, whispering words Ethan couldn't hear. Then he lowered himself slowly, almost awkwardly, to one knee. The Russian colonel bowed his head before the stone that carried no names but all names. Ethan watched his chest tight. He knew better than to break silence. But something inside him shifted again, seeing a man once swollen with arrogance now kneeling where no command had forced him. When Orlov rose, his eyes were damp. He turned to Ethan, held his gaze, and in halting English said softly, "Hayes, I remember." Ethan's throat ached, but he didn't speak. He only nodded once, sharp and solemn. Orlov replaced his cap, gave Ethan a final look that carried both gratitude and humility, and walked away into the deepening night. The guard on duty struck his heel, turned, and resumed his 21 steps. The tomb remained unchanged, eternal, but the silence around it carried a new story. Now one that stretched from Kunduz to Washington, from fire and smoke to marble and stillness. Ethan placed his hand against the stone, whispering once more for Hayes, and in that moment he understood that his silence had spoken across nations. The week after the forum closed, Washington exhaled, but the story didn't die. It lived in papers on screens and in whispered conversations at dinner tables. It reached across oceans, translated into languages Ethan Ward could not read, carried into countries he'd never stepped foot in. The 30-second video had turned into something more, a parable about silence, discipline, and sacrifice. Ethan's days returned to routine. He marched the 21 steps at Arlington, his boots striking marble in measured rhythm. Tourists gathered in reverent hush, not because of the viral story, but because that hush was demanded by the tomb itself. Still, Ethan could feel the weight of extra eyes, the way cameras lingered a little longer when he passed. He ignored it all. For him, nothing had changed. His duty was the same: stand for the fallen. Major Sarah Collins, though, knew everything had changed. She sifted through stacks of emails and calls routed from veterans groups, civic organizations, even foreign dignitaries. Everyone wanted something: a statement, a ceremony, a chance to turn what had happened into a platform. Collins deflected most her answer steady. The tomb guard speaks only through silence. Yet she knew this wouldn't stop. Colonel James Whitaker sat in his modest office with the tarnished red star still in his possession. He kept it on his desk, not displayed, not hidden, but resting on a square of felt like an unresolved question. He would pick it up sometimes, turning it over, feeling its weight. He told himself he was waiting. For what he wasn't sure, perhaps for the day it would be placed somewhere it belonged. On the other side of the world, Orlov returned to Moscow. The Kremlin wanted his voice sharpened, his narrative polished into one of insult and grievance. He gave them what they wanted in official statements, but privately, he remained silent. In the privacy of his office, he opened his notebook and read the name he had written: Hayes. He traced the letters with his thumb, remembering fire and hands dragging him through. He whispered the name aloud in Russian-accented English, as though trying to keep it alive. Days later, an unexpected message reached Whitaker. A formal letter on Russian military stationery delivered through diplomatic channels. The translation was clipped, but the words were unmistakable. To the family of Sergeant Daniel Hayes, I write to acknowledge a debt I cannot repay. I was pulled from fire by your son. I survived because of his sacrifice. I did not know his name until now. I will not forget it. The letter was unsigned to the public, but Whitaker knew whose hand had written it. He read it twice, then set it aside, his throat tight. Claire Donovan caught wind of the letter through her network of contacts. She didn't publish it yet. She wanted permission from the Hayes family first. She visited them in person, sitting in a living room where photos of Daniel still hung on the wall. His mother, Marie Hayes held the letter with trembling hands, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. He remembered him, she whispered. After all these years, he remembered. Claire asked gently, "Do you want the world to see this?" Marie shook her head. "Not yet. Let it stay with us for now. Daniel deserves a little peace first." Claire agreed. She left the house with her notebook untouched, carrying only the memory of a mother's tears. For once, she felt no rush to publish. Some truths needed time. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his silent watch. One evening after his shift, he stayed at the tomb watching the new guard begin his steps. The marble glowed under the setting sun, and Ethan felt the quiet deepen. He placed his hand against the stone, whispering, "Hayes, they remember you now." In Moscow, Orlov sat alone in his study, a glass of vodka untouched beside him. He stared out at the snow falling softly beyond his window. He pressed his hand to his heart, the same gesture he had made in the plaza. This time it wasn't for cameras or crowds. It was for a man buried far away whose name he had finally learned. In that moment, two soldiers, one in Arlington, one in Moscow, were bound by the memory of Hayes. Bound not by politics, not by pride, but by sacrifice. And though no headlines captured it, that was the real story. The late summer air around Arlington carried a strange energy, part reverence, part curiosity. The crowds that gathered at the tomb were larger now, drawn not just by tradition, but by the story that had refused to fade. Teachers brought school children. Veterans arrived in wheelchairs, saluting stiffly as the guard passed. Families whispered the names of their own lost, pressing hands against the cold marble, as if to share them with the unknown. Ethan Ward kept his focus on the 21 steps, but he felt the shift. Silence was heavier now, not fragile, but alive, charged with meaning. Every click of his heel against the stone seemed to echo across more than the plaza. It rippled into living rooms, classrooms, and quiet kitchens across the country. Yet Ethan never let his face show it. He was a sentinel, not a symbol. Colonel Whitaker saw what was happening. He stood at the edge of the crowd one afternoon, watching people file past some lingering longer than rules allowed. He didn't stop them. The tomb had become not just a place of remembrance, but a bridge between griefs. Whitaker felt pride, but also caution. Too much light, too much attention, and the essence of the ritual could be consumed by spectacle. Later in his office, he held the red star again. Sarah Collins entered without knocking, her expression serious. Sir, the Hayes family reached out. They want to hold a private ceremony. No cameras, just them and the guard. Whitaker looked at the star, then at Collins. They deserve that. He slipped the relic into its pouch. Arrange it. The following evening, as dusk turned the sky violet, the Hayes family gathered quietly at Arlington. Ethan was chosen to stand guard during the ceremony, his figure tall and steady as ever. Marie Hayes held a folded flag close to her chest, her eyes shining with both sorrow and pride. The silence was complete, the only sound the measured cadence of Ethan's boots. When the ceremony ended, Whitaker approached Marie. He placed the pouch in her hand. "This was taken from a man your son carried from fire. It came back here because your son gave everything. It belongs to you now." Marie opened the pouch slowly, her breath catching at the sight of the tarnished metal. She ran her thumb over its worn grooves, whispering, "He touched this in his last moments." Her younger son placed a hand on her shoulder. "Now it comes home with him." Ethan, still at his post, felt the moment as though it pierced his own chest. He didn't move, didn't break his bearing, but his throat ached with the weight of it. News of the private ceremony never leaked in full. Only fragments spread whispers of a Russian relic handed to a grieving family, of a mother holding it against her heart. Claire Donovan. Though she knew the details, chose not to publish. She wrote instead about the endurance of silence, how the truest stories were carried not in headlines, but in the quiet of families and rituals guarded by discipline. Across the Atlantic, Orlov sat in his office when he received word of the ceremony. His aide delivered the news carefully. The relic was given to Hayes' family. The Americans closed the story with honor. Orlov dismissed the aide, then sat in the dim room alone. He closed his eyes and saw again the fire, the hands dragging him, the face of a man whose name he had carried back across oceans. For the first time, Orlov allowed himself a long, unbroken weep, not for politics, not for nations, but for Daniel Hayes. Back in Arlington, Ethan completed his shift and returned to his quarters. He untied his boots, sat on the edge of his bed, and let out a long breath. He thought of Hayes. He thought of Orlov kneeling at the tomb. He thought of Marie clutching the red star like a relic of faith. He whispered into the empty room. Stillness carries farther than we know. And though no one heard, the silence seemed to answer him back. Autumn crept into Virginia, the leaves in Arlington glowing in shades of gold and crimson. Tourists wrapped scarves around their necks as they filed up the hill, breath puffing in the crisp air. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood immutable, its marble surface cold against the shifting season, and Ethan Ward's steps echoed as steady as ever. Yet beyond the plaza, change was undeniable. Letters flooded the old guard's office, handwritten notes, drawings from schoolchildren, messages from veterans. Many bore a single name, Hayes. Some were addressed directly to Ethan, though he never read them. Others were written to the guard who stood. Colonel Whitaker kept them in boxes, unsure what to do with the growing tide of testimony. Claire Donovan continued to write, but carefully. Her articles had shifted tone, no longer about confrontation or conflict, but about remembrance, dignity, and the cost of service. The silence of the guard, she wrote, teaches us that there are stories we honor not by shouting them louder, but by holding them still. Her words traveled farther than she ever expected, cited in classrooms, read aloud at veterans' halls. Meanwhile, Orlov lived a quieter life than Moscow had hoped. His official duties continued, but he avoided cameras, sidestepped press. He had given what the state demanded, but privately he retreated. His aides whispered that he had grown distant, restless. At night, he was seen walking alone, stopping at memorials, bowing his head in silence. Some mocked him for it, others admired him, but Orlov no longer cared. One day as the sun dipped low over Arlington, a small group of foreign officers arrived. They wore uniforms of nations that had once been adversaries, their faces solemn as they stepped forward in pairs. They did not demand salutes. They did not disrupt the silence. They stood quietly, caps in hand, some even kneeling for a moment before the tomb. Ethan noticed but did not waver. His cadence remained unbroken, but within he understood Hayes' sacrifice had traveled beyond one soldier, one war, one confrontation. That night, Whitaker gathered his senior officers in the briefing room. He laid the Red Star's empty pouch on the table. "Gentlemen, the family has taken possession. That chapter is closed. But what it sparked, what it awakened, doesn't end here." Major Collins leaned forward. "Sir, the crowds keep growing. Veterans groups want to establish a permanent marker near the plaza, something that names Hayes." Whitaker shook his head. "The tomb carries all names. To carve one would be to diminish the rest." He paused. "But perhaps there's another way." Weeks later, a quiet ceremony unfolded at dusk. Without cameras, without spectacle, the guard raised a new plaque near the entrance to the cemetery. It bore not Hayes' name, but words etched in stone. "To all who carried another through fire, known or unknown." Ethan stood watch that night, and as the last rays of sun brushed the marble, he felt the weight of that inscription. It wasn't just for Hayes, it was for all who had given themselves in ways history would never fully record. Marie Hayes visited soon after pressing her hand against the plaque. She whispered, "That's him, that's my Daniel." And in Moscow, though, he never spoke of it publicly. Orlov received a photo of the plaque. He stared at the words, lips trembling before whispering, "That is him too." The world continued headlines, shifting to new crises, new confrontations. But the silence at Arlington remained heavier than news cycles, stronger than politics. And the rhythm of Ethan's boots went on, carrying the stillness across time. Winter descended over Arlington in a hush of white. Snow lay across the marble steps, each flake dissolving beneath Ethan Ward's boots as he paced his eternal 21. Breath curled from his lips in frosted plumes, but his bearing never wavered. The tomb stood wrapped in silence, a silence deeper than any season could disturb. The crowds had thinned with the cold, yet those who came still lingered. Veterans bundled in heavy coats stood shoulder to shoulder with children holding small flags. They came not for spectacle, but for something more enduring, the knowledge that even in bitter winds someone stood guard. That promise had not faltered. Colonel Whitaker watched from beneath the brim of his cap, the cold biting through his gloves. He reflected on how far they had come since that tense day with Orlov, the moment when silence had clashed with arrogance. Now, months later, the plaza bore not the echo of insult, but the weight of reconciliation. Hayes's name had returned. His mother had found some measure of peace. Even Orlov, half a world away, had changed, whether he admitted it or not. Sarah Collins joined Whitaker at the edge of the crowd. "Sir," she said quietly, "I think Hayes would have been proud of what's come of this." Whitaker nodded, his eyes fixed on Ethan's steady march. Proud and humbled. That's the thing about silence, Major. It carries more than we ever think it can. In Moscow, Orlov stood at his own window as snow drifted down onto Red Square. He raised his glass in a silent toast, not to power, not to state, but to a man he had never truly known. "Hayes," he whispered. His voice cracked, and for once, he let it. Back in Arlington, Marie Hayes returned on Christmas Eve. She came alone, her breath misting in the cold night. She carried no cameras, no crowd followed her. She approached the plaque etched with words for those who carried others through fire, and she pressed her gloved hand against it. For a long time she stood there, tears slipping down her cheeks, whispering her son's name. Ethan, on watch, caught sight of her. He didn't move, didn't break, but within something in him stirred. He marched his measured steps, letting the silence cradle her grief. That was his duty, his gift to her. Later, as he left his post, he passed near where she stood. She looked up at him, eyes swollen but grateful. She mouthed the words, "Thank you." Ethan simply touched the brim of his cap and moved on his silence, answering for him. The world rolled into a new year, its noise unending. But at Arlington, silence reigned, silence of boots striking marble, silence of hands clutching folded flags, silence of names whispered only in hearts. And in that silence lay the story of Daniel Hayes, of Ethan Ward, of James Whitaker, Sarah Collins, Claire Donovan, and even of Victor Orlov. It was a story not of commands shouted or orders given, but of stillness, sacrifice, and remembrance. The guard marched on, and the silence carried farther than anyone could measure. If you like the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more similar stories. Now click on the video on the screen to hear another story that is equally powerful and compelling, with courage, sacrifice, and a choice that makes you question everything you know about duty and justice. Click on the video